The Philippines is on alert. Across the archipelago, from the northernmost tip of Luzon to the southernmost islands of Mindanao, emergency signals are being raised, evacuation orders are being issued, and millions of Filipinos are bracing for what meteorologists are now calling one of the most dangerous weather systems to approach the country this season. This is not a drill. The warnings are real, the threat is real, and the consequences for anyone who ignores them could be catastrophic. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand the geography of the Philippines. The country is made up of more than 7,000 islands, stretching across a vast section of the western Pacific Ocean. That location puts it directly in the path of typhoons that form in the warm waters of the Pacific and travel westward towards Southeast Asia. The Philippines experiences an average of 20 typhoons per year, more than almost any other country on the planet. Some of those typhoons are manageable, some of them are not. And when the atmospheric conditions align in just the wrong way, the Philippines becomes the front line of one of nature's most destructive forces. The current system developing in the Pacific is already being tracked by the Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Services Administration, known as PAGASA, which is the country's national weather agency. PAGASA has been monitoring the tropical disturbance since it first organized as a weather system several days ago, and what they have seen in the air data has prompted a series of escalating warnings. The system has been intensifying. The warm ocean temperatures, the low wind shear, and the favorable atmospheric conditions have all combined to accelerate the development of this typhoon into something that forecasters are watching with deep concern. Typhoon warnings in the Philippines operate on a numbered signal system. Signal number 1 means that storm force winds are expected within 36 hours. Signal number 2 means winds of stronger intensity are expected within 24 hours. Signal number 3 is issued when very destructive typhoon force winds are expected within 18 hours. And signal number 4, the highest level, means extremely destructive typhoon force winds are expected within 12 hours. The fact that multiple provinces are already under elevated signals is a strong indication of how seriously authorities are treating this threat. The areas currently under warning include a broad swath of the Philippine landmass. Coastal communities are the most immediately vulnerable, and those living along the eastern seaboard of Luzon are being told to prepare for the worst. Storm surges, which are walls of water pushed inland by typhoon-force winds, have historically been the deadliest component of typhoons striking the Philippines. When Typhoon Hainan struck the country in 2013, it was not the wind alone that killed more than 6,000 people. It was the storm surge. In some areas, the water rose more than 6 meters above normal sea level, engulfing entire towns in a matter of minutes. That is the kind of threat that emergency managers are thinking about right now as this new system approaches. Emergency operations centers across the country have been activated. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, the NDRRMC, has placed all regional offices on red alert status. Local government units in the path of the storm have been instructed to pre-position emergency supplies, open evacuation centers, and begin reaching out to communities in high-risk zones. The military and Coast Guard have suspended all sea travel advisories in affected regions, meaning that fishing boats and passenger ferries have been ordered back to port. Airlines have already begun announcing flight cancellations and reschedulings for airports in the projected path of the storm. What makes this typhoon particularly concerning is the speed at which it has intensified. Rapid intensification is one of the most dangerous phenomena in tropical meteorology. It occurs when a tropical cyclone increases its maximum sustained winds by at least 35 kilometers per hour within a 24-hour period. Climate scientists have been documenting an increase in rapid intensification events over the past 2 decades, and the current system has undergone exactly this kind of accelerated development. A storm that looked manageable 48 hours ago now looks significantly more dangerous, and the forecasters at PAGASA are working around the clock to refine their track and intensity predictions. The projected path of the typhoon takes it over some of the most densely populated parts of the Philippines. The provinces of Eastern Samar, Leyte, and Southern Leyte are in the direct path, and these are communities that have lived through devastating typhoons before. They remember Haiyan, they remember the destruction. And that memory, while traumatic, has also made many of these communities more prepared than they were a decade ago. New seawalls, elevated roads, and improved evacuation routes have been built in the years since that disaster. Early warning systems have been upgraded, but infrastructure can only do so much against a sufficiently powerful storm. In the capital region of Metro Manila, the situation is different but still serious. While Manila itself may not receive the direct impact of the typhoon's eyewall, the outer bands of a large typhoon can bring heavy rainfall, flooding, and strong winds to the metropolitan area. Manila is a city of more than 13 million people, many of whom live in low-lying areas that are highly susceptible to flooding. The Pasig River and the surrounding river systems have flooded dramatically during previous typhoon events, and emergency managers in the city are already positioning pumping equipment and clearing waterways in anticipation of heavy rainfall. Agriculture is another area of deep concern as this typhoon approaches. The Philippines is a predominantly agricultural country, with rice and corn being the primary crops grown across the lowland plains of Luzon and Mindanao. A typhoon arriving at the wrong time in the agricultural calendar can destroy harvests that farming. Ours have spent months cultivating. The loss of standing crops translates directly into food insecurity for rural communities and price increases for consumers across the country. The Department of Agriculture has been assessing the potential impact on the harvest season and coordinating with local agricultural offices to advise farmers on protecting their crops wherever possible. The fishing communities along the coasts face an immediate and life-threatening situation. Thousands of small-scale fishermen who depend on the sea for their livelihood are being ordered to bring their boats to shore and secure them. For many of these fishermen, their boat is their most valuable possession, representing years of savings and their only means of income. Losing a boat to a typhoon can mean financial ruin. But the greater concern of emergency responders is that some fishermen, reluctant to leave their boats unattended or unwilling to lose fishing time, have historically remained at sea even as typhoons approached. Those decisions have cost lives, and authorities are reinforcing the message clearly. No boat is worth a human life, and the sea must be abandoned now. The health sector is preparing for the aftermath as much as for the storm itself. Hospitals in the projected impact zone are checking their emergency generators, securing their medical supplies, and reviewing their disaster protocols. Field hospitals and medical response teams are being positioned at staging areas outside the danger zone, ready to move in as soon as the storm passes. One of the consistent challenges following major typhoons in the Philippines is the disruption of clean water supplies. When flooding contaminates water sources and overwhelms water treatment infrastructure, waterborne diseases like leptospirosis, cholera, and typhoid can spread rapidly through affected communities. Health officials are already pre-positioning water purification supplies, oral rehydration salts, and disease surveillance teams. The telecommunications sector is also a critical concern. When major typhoons strike the Philippines, one of the first things to go offline is mobile communication infrastructure. Cell towers are destroyed by winds, power outages knock out backup systems, and the silence that follows leaves emergency respo. And is unable to communicate with affected communities and leaves families unable to reach their loved ones. Telecommunications companies have been asked to accelerate the hardening of their most critical infrastructure in the typhoon path and to pre-position satellite communication systems that can function without the terrestrial network. Power utilities are similarly preparing for disruption. Electricity is typically among the first services lost in a typhoon and among the last to be restored. In some remote areas affected by previous typhoons, power restoration took months. The Department of Energy has coordinated with electric cooperatives across affected regions to pre-position repair crews and materials so that restoration efforts can begin immediately once it is safe to deploy them. For hospitals, emergency facilities, and water pumping stations, backup generator fuel supplies are being checked and replenished now. The evacuation process itself is one of the most complex logistical challenges in disaster management. Moving large numbers of people from vulnerable areas to safer locations requires coordination across multiple government agencies, an understanding of which communities are most at risk, access to adequate transportation, and the availability of evacuation centers that are themselves safe from the storm. The Philippines has made significant progress in its evacuation systems over the years, but challenges remain. Many evacuation centers are school buildings that, while structurally more sound than informal housing, are not designed to withstand a direct hit from a major typhoon. Overcrowding is another persistent issue, as is the reluctance of many families to leave their homes and possessions behind. Cultural factors play a role in evacuation compliance that disaster managers have grappled with for decades. Many Filipino communities have strong emotional and economic ties to their homes. The Bayanihan spirit, the communal culture of helping one another, is admirable, but it can also lead people to stay behind to help neighbors or protect property rather than evacuating when ordered. Government officials have learned over time that mandatory evacuation orders need to be delivered with clear explanations of the specific dangers involved, rather than generic warnings, because people respond better when they understand exactly what they are being asked to flee from. Children, the elderly, and people with disabilities require special attention in any evacuation scenario. These groups face additional vulnerabilities during typhoons and are often the most difficult to reach and assist. Local social welfare officers are working with barangay officials to identify and prioritize the most vulnerable residents in their communities and to ensure that transportation and accommodations are available for those who cannot independently evacuate. The closure of schools across the affected regions has already been announced, ensuring that parents can focus on their families rather than managing school schedules during the critical preparation window. The international community is watching the situation closely. The Philippines has strong relationships with international disaster response organizations, and several humanitarian agencies have already placed their regional teams on standby. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has been in contact with Philippine authorities, and bilateral partners, including the United States, Japan, and Australia, have offered disaster response assistance through their diplomatic channels. The deployment of international assets typically happens in the post-storm phase, but pre-positioning of supplies and readiness of response teams is already underway. Climate change is an unavoidable part of the conversation whenever a major typhoon threatens the Philippines. The scientific consensus is clear that while climate change does not necessarily increase the total number of tropical cyclones globally, it does increase the likelihood that those storms which do form will be more intense. Warmer ocean temperatures provide more energy to developing storms, while increased atmospheric moisture gives them more fuel to sustain and intensify. The Philippines, despite contributing minimally to global greenhouse gas emissions, bears a disproportionate burden of the consequences of climate change through precisely these kinds of intensifying storm events. Filipino climate advocates have been vocal on this point for years, and the international community's attention to this inequality has grown, but the material consequences continue to accumulate. The question of reconstruction and recovery is never far from the minds of Philippine officials when a major typhoon is approaching. The cost of rebuilding after a large typhoon can run into billions of pesos and consume significant portions of both local and national budgets. The backlog of reconstruction from previous typhoons has sometimes meant that T communities are still rebuilding when the next major storm arrives. This cycle of damage, partial recovery, and renewed damage is one of the most challenging aspects of disaster management in a country that faces this level of recurring risk. The national government has been working on longer-term resilience, programs that aim to move vulnerable communities out of high-risk zones entirely. But those programs require sustained political will and funding that is difficult to maintain across multiple administrations. For the fishermen waiting on shore, for the farmers watching the sky, for the parents deciding whether to load their children and belongings into a vehicle and drive inland, the abstract discussions of policy and climate science are less important than the immediate reality of the storm that is coming. The Philippines has survived countless typhoons. Its people are resilient in ways that are difficult for outsiders to fully appreciate. The communities that have lived through the worst disasters have rebuilt, sometimes more than once. They have buried their dead, cleared the debris, and started again. That resilience is not diminished by the danger of what is approaching now, but resilience should never be confused with invulnerability. The lesson of every major typhoon that has struck the Philippines is that the combination of early warning, rapid evacuation, and community preparedness saves lives. The lesson of every tragedy within those typhoons est that the deaths which occur are overwhelmingly concentrated among those who did not or could not evacuate. The technology, the warning systems, the emergency protocols, the evacuation infrastructure, all of it exists to give people time and options. What happens with that time and those options determines outcomes that no meteorologist and no government official can control once the storm arrives. PAGASA will continue to issue updates as the system moves toward the Philippine landmass. The track may shift, the intensity may fluctuate. Typhoons are inherently uncertain systems, and the most honest thing any forecaster can say is that the situation is evolving, and that the range of possible outcomes span from serious but manageable to catastrophic. That uncertainty is itself the reason to act on the most serious scenario rather than the most optimistic one. Preparing for a less severe outcome costs effort and inconvenience. Failing to prepare for a severe outcome can cost everything. The barangays are being cleared. The evacuation centers are opening. The fishing boats are being pulled ashore. The emergency generators are being fueled. The relief supplies are being staged. The warnings are going out over radio, television, social media, and the outdoor warning systems that have been installed in coastal communities since Haiyan. A nation that has learned from its losses, that has invested in its systems, and that now faces another test of those systems, is putting everything it has built to use. What happens next depends on the storm, and the storm does not negotiate. It does not respond to appeals for mercy or make exceptions for communities that have already suffered. It simply arrives with whatever intensity the atmosphere has given it, and when it does, the only thing that matters is whether the preparations were sufficient and whether the people who needed to move did so in time. The Philippines is watching, the Philippines is preparing, the Philippines is on alert, and every hour between now and landfall is an hour that can still be used to save lives. The role of local government units in the Philippines cannot be overstated when it comes to typhoon preparedness and response. The barangay captain, the most local level of elected official in the Philippine political system, is often the first point of contact for residents seeking information or assistance during a disaster. These local leaders know their communities intimately. They know which families live in flood-prone areas. They know which elderly residents live alone without family support. They know the roads that flood first and the communities that become isolated when rivers rise. In the hours before a typhoon makes landfall, the barangay captain is typically the most important government official in the lives of ordinary people, and the quality of local leadership has a measurable impact on the casualty figures when the storm passes. The Philippine Coast Guard has been conducting search and rescue preparation along the coastlines of the affected regions. Rescue boats have been inspected and fueled, dive teams have been assembled, communication systems have been tested. The Coast Guard is well aware of the particular danger of storm surges in the areas where this typhoon is projected to make landfall, and their prepositioning strategy reflects the expectation that they will need to conduct water rescues in areas that were dry land before the storm arrived. The speed with which rescue teams can reach isolated communities after a typhoon is one of the critical variables that determines survival outcomes for people trapped by flooding or debris. The Armed Forces of the Philippines has also been placed on disaster response footing. Military helicopters have been repositioned to air bases that will be outside the primary impact zone, but close enough to conduct rapid assessment and delivery flights as soon as the storm passes. This positioning is essential because helicopters are often the only means of reaching the most remote island communities in the immediate aftermath of a major typhoon, when roads are blocked by fallen trees and debris, and when bridges have been damaged or destroyed. The military's disaster response experience, built over decades of typhoon events, makes it one of the most capable components of the national response system. School buildings across the Philippines serve a dual purpose in typhoon events. During the preparation phase, the closure of schools allows parents to focus on their families and eliminates the need to manage thousands of students during an emergency. But school buildings themselves, often the most structurally sound structures in rural communities, become typhoon evacuation centers. The Department of Education coordinates with local government units to ensure that schools being used as evacuation centers are cleared of furniture and equipment that could The role of social media in typhoon warnings in the Philippines has grown enormously over the past decade. Pagasa regularly updates its official social media accounts with track forecasts, rainfall predictions, and signal updates. Local government units use Facebook and other platforms to disseminate evacuation orders and shelter locations to their constituents. Community Facebook groups have become informal but important channels for sharing real-time information about road conditions, shelter availability, and community needs. This democratization of information has been broadly positive, but it has also created challenges, particularly the rapid spread of misinformation. False reports about storm tracks, fake evacuation orders, and exaggerated or minimized descriptions of the storm's intensity can confuse residents and undermine the official emergency communication system. Authorities have learned to actively counter misinformation in real time, often devoting staff specifically to monitoring social media and correcting false information as it spreads. The Philippine Red Cross is among the most active non-governmental organizations in typhoon response in the country. With chapters across the archipelago and a network of trained volunteers in virtually every community, the Red Cross provides services ranging from blood supply management and first aid training to search and rescue operations and psychosocial support for disaster survivors. In the lead up to this typhoon, Red Cross chapters in the projected impact zone have been distributing family emergency kits, running community briefings on typhoon preparedness, and coordinating with local government units on evacuation logistics. The organization has also been activating its emergency blood supply protocols to ensure that hospitals in the path of the storm have adequate reserves before the storm arrives and before roads become impassable. The question of insurance and financial protection for typhoon-affected residents is one that has received increasing attention in the Philippines in recent years. Most ordinary Filipino households do not have property insurance. The structures they live in, many of which are informal housing or lightweight construction, would not qualify for commercial insurance, even if the residents could afford it. When a typhoon destroys a family's home and possessions, the financial recovery depends primarily on government assistance, community support, and informal borrowing networks. The Philippine government has been working to develop more accessible disaster microinsurance products, and some community-based organizations have piloted innovative models for collective financial protection. But coverage remains far too low relative to the level of risk the population faces. Remittances from overseas Filipino workers play a critical and often underappreciated role in disaster recovery across the Philippines. The Philippines has one of the largest overseas worker populations in the world. with millions of Filipinos employed in countries across the Middle East, East Asia, North America, and Europe. When a typhoon strikes and a family loses their home, a remittance from a brother or sister working abroad can provide the immediate financial bridge that allows the family to begin rebuilding. This informal financial safety net has no official status in disaster management plans, but experienced disaster responders in the Philippines understand it as a real and significant component of community resilience. The water supply situation in typhoon-affected areas requires specific attention. Many communities in typhoon-prone areas of the Philippines rely on shallow wells or spring sources that are highly vulnerable to contamination from flooding. When typhoon rainfall and storm surges mix with sewage, agricultural runow, FF, and industrial waste, the resulting contamination can persist in water sources for weeks after the storm passes. Waterborne disease outbreaks following typhoons in the Philippines are not historical curiosities. They are recurring events that health officials prepare for every time a major storm approaches. The distribution of water purification tablets, the deployment of emergency water tanks, and the rapid assessment of water source contamination are standard components of the post-typhoon health response. Mental health is another dimension of typhoon impact that has received growing recognition in the Philippines. Surviving a major typhoon, particularly one involving significant loss of life in a community, can cause lasting psychological trauma. Children who witness the destruction of their homes or the death of family members, adults who lose their livelihoods in a matter of hours, entire communities that experience intense collective grief in the aftermath of a disaster, all of these people have mental health needs that are as real as their physical health needs. The Philippines has been working to build psychosocial support capacity at the community level, training barangay health workers to recognize signs of trauma and to provide basic psychological first aid in the immediate aftermath of disasters. The reconstruction phase following a major typhoon is when the Philippines faces its most complex and enduring challenges. The immediate emergency response, search and rescue, medical treatment, food and water distribution, temporary shelter provision, can be mobilized relatively quickly when the system is working well. But the longer-term reconstruction of homes, schools, health facilities, roads, bridges, and power infrastructure takes years. It requires sustained funding, technical expertise, and administrative capacity that are often stretched thin in the provinces most affected by typhoons, which tend to be among the least economically developed parts of the country. The concentration of typhoon impacts in poorer provinces and communities is not accidental. It reflects the same patterns of vulnerability that shape disaster risk globally. Those with the least resources to protect themselves and recover from disasters are the ones who live in the most exposed locations and in the most vulnerable structures. As this typhoon approaches, the government and the people of the Philippines are doing what they have done before and what they will need to do again. They are taking the warnings seriously. They are moving people out of danger. They are preparing their systems and their personnel. They are communicating ACR, access every available channel. And they are holding on to the knowledge that despite the scale of the threat, preparation and early action genuinely make a difference. The typhoon is coming, but so is the response. And in the critical hours before landfall, those two things, the storm and the response, are in a race that the Philippines has run before and knows how to compete in, even if it cannot always win. The days ahead will be difficult. The communities in the path of this storm will face hardship that is difficult to convey from a distance. But the Philippines has institutions, communities, and people who have faced this before. The NDRR MC coordinators working through the night, the barangay captains walking door to door, the Coast Guard crews checking their boats, the nurses and doctors reviewing their emergency plans, the teachers opening their schools as shelters, the overseas Filipinos watching the news from thousands of miles away and calling home to check on their families. All of them, in their different ways, are part of the response that defines how the Philippines meets this moment. The alert is raised. The preparations are underway. The people are moving. And the Philippines, 7,000 islands and more than 100 million people, is facing what it has faced many times before, with the same combination of fear, determination, grief, and resilience that has carried it through every storm.